When I take a look at my bookshelf, I see works with titles such as The Outlaws of Sherwood by Robin McKinley, The Arrow of Sherwood by Lauren Johnson, and DVDs for films such as Rogues of Sherwood Forest, or the television series from the 80s, Robin of Sherwood. Indeed, there is no name or place as synonymous with Robin Hood as that of Sherwood Forest. The name evokes a sense of towering old-growth forest, thick foliage that might conceal a dun deer or a cunning outlaw. It is a place of danger and mystery one moment, and mirth and merriment the next. While Camelot represents the idealized medieval castle and the glorious society humans have the capacity to construct, Sherwood is the idealized notion of humans and nature coexisting outside the bounds of a society that has fallen short of its promised glories. Unlike Camelot, though, Sherwood Forest was a very real place. And while it is now just a tiny fraction of the size it would have been during the Middle Ages, it is still very much a real place in the heart of the English Midlands, and filled with majestic oaks that would have been young trees when the ballads of Robin Hood were first being sung some 700 years ago. Talking to someone who works in Sherwood Forest was always a top priority for the podcast. So I'm grateful to the RSPB for putting me in touch with Visitor Experience Officer Andrew West, who was kind enough to put aside an hour of time, no small task when you've got a new baby in the house, to talk all about Sherwood Forest. During the course of the interview, we discussed the biodiversity of the forest, how it has changed over time, what sorts of food and resources an outlaw sheltering in the forest would have available to them, why it's trickier to tell the age of an oak tree than you might think, some simple tips for how to get involved in conservation, and introduce you to a wild cast of characters with names like Stumpy, Medusa, and Rotten Roger. This is Into the Greenwood, a podcast where we aim to take a look at every angle pertaining to the most famous outlaw who may never have been. I'm your host, Thaddeus, and today we're looking at the location most responsible for inspiring this podcast's name, with Visitor Experience Officer Andrew West of Sherwood Forest.
Joining me here in the Greenwood is someone who is from the Greenwood. I have Andrew West, who works for the RSPB in Sherwood Forest, right?
That is correct. I am a visitor experience officer. So basically what my job is that I plan events, activities. I'm just there to make sure the people who are coming to the forest are having a good time and have things to be able to do. So it's a pretty amazing job. And it is at the Sherwood Forest, the home of Robin Hood, what is left of it, but it is the actual forest.
That's right there in the middle of England, near Nottingham, all of that. Now, how did you come to be working in Sherwood?
So it all started it actually started with me working in education. I was a teaching assistant. And in my very last year, there were a lot of problems. Education is a very hard work environment, and I have no problem admitting I couldn't cut it. So we'd just done a science week called Bird Week. And at the end of that week, I went to a flower show with my mum. We, by pure coincidence, met the RSPB. They were fundraising there, got chatting to them, and I asked them, have you got any jobs going? So that started my journey with the RSPB. I was a fundraiser for 2 years. Used to go out to Sherwood quite often because I live and I'm, born and raised in Nottingham. And because I went there quite often, eventually, when we took over, there were some jobs going, and sort of they said to me, would you like to apply? I did, managed to get the position, and that's how I started my journey at Sherwood.
So what exactly is the RSPB?
So the RSPB is the largest nature organization in Europe. So we're known as the bird people because it's in our name, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. However, we do everything in nature these days. We've got about 240 nature reserves all over the country that we manage. They're quite large scale, some of them as well. And we are just there to take care of nature because unfortunately it is in a lot of trouble. I know we're going to go over a bit of that today, but I don't even have time to go over the endless problems that the UK is faced with when it comes to our wildlife.
Yeah. So speaking of the wildlife there, if somebody were to go to Sherwood Forest, what sorts of animals, and also plant species for that matter, would they expect to encounter?
So you're mostly looking at birds and small mammals. So we've got about 79 different species of bird that is found regularly at Sherwood. We've got things like barn and tawny owls. So we've got those kind of predators. We've got species like all three kinds of woodpecker, the greater, the lesser, and the green. If you can guess what color the green is, bonus points for you. We're not very inventive when we name our birds, are we? So there's plenty of birds like nuthatches, robins, tree creepers, all sorts of fascinating species. When it comes to the mammals, we're typically looking on the smaller side of things. We do occasionally get deer wander into the forest, but there's no actual resident herd in what is left. There is a resident herd on the Thoresby estate. We're pretty much joined up. And, a few kind of wander over occasionally, but that's it in terms of large mammals. So we're looking at things like badgers and foxes. They'll be the largest things you can find. But then we're going down to the smaller ones like lots of squirrels, hedgehogs, smaller still like the mice, the voles, the shrews, all of those kind of creatures, and a host of insects. There is huge biological diversity when it comes to ancient oak forests. Insects make up a huge part of that.
And so you mentioned it as an oak forest. So
absolutely,
that therefore implies that there are oak trees there. What other sort of plant life can be found?
So the most about the plant life you're going to be seeing is things like the oaks, which are peduncular oaks. We've got two different kinds, and I love that word too much not to throw it in there. We've got a lot of silver birches. We have a lot of other tree species as well, like sycamore, yew. There's some hazel, there's some ash, there's some rowan. There's all sorts of tree species, but it is dominated by the oaks and the silver birch. The sycamore does get cleared down in certain areas just because it's an invasive species, really. It takes over so fast and it's a really dense canopy, so you don't want a lot of sycamore. So that's your main sort of, that's your trees. There's a lot of plant life on the ground, like ferns and bracken. We've got brambles all over the place. I believe it was Julius Caesar that absolutely hated Britain, and brambles were one of the big reasons. They're an absolute nightmare. They root deep, the thorns are sharp, they make getting through the forest next to impossible.
I know I saw a few foxgloves when I was there myself.
Yep. It's one of the surprising things is that there's not a huge amount of flower in the forest. Because so much of it is that dense canopy, not a lot of light gets through. So we do have certain patches of things like bluebells, we've got the foxgloves, there's all sorts, but you don't find as many as you might expect in a really natural place. It doesn't have much flower. Most of the flowering comes from the trees.
So just real quick, what was that word you said again with the oaks? Peduncular?
Yes. So there's two species of oak in the UK. One is peduncular, one is sessile. Peduncular is the more dominant one. That's the one you find more often than not. But there are two species, peduncular and sessile.
That's, helping get people an idea of what Sherwood Forest is like now. Birds, small mammals, oaks, sycamores, ferns, brambles. When people think of Sherwood Forest, though, a lot of times they're thinking about the Sherwood Forest of hundreds of years ago. They're associating it with Robin Hood. They're associating it with the idea of outlaws living in this forest.
Yep.
And one of the things that comes up a lot, of course, in Robin Hood stories is the idea of poaching deer. As you mentioned, there's not a resident herd of deer there anymore. It covers up a lot less land now than it used to, of course. How else has that kind of landscape changed? What is different now about Sherwood Forest, aside from the footprint, than in the Middle Ages?
So apart from, you say, as the obvious one of the footprint, that it's gone from 100,000 acres to 1,000 essentially. So when it comes to the wildlife, that has changed quite significantly. So one of the big presences in these kind of forests back in the medieval era, wolves, keystone species. You know, your classic example in Yellowstone saw what happened when you got rid of them, decided, hey, great idea bringing those back. They were a very interesting animal because they would have been the absolute bane of people like Robin Hood's existences. January was known as Wolf Month because that's the point where they are starting to get really hungry, and normally wolves would have stayed away from human settlements. That's the time that they started to edge their way in. Well, if you're an outlaw out in that forest, that's what you're going to have to contend with. So wolves would have been one of the most important ones to them because that affects their safety. In terms of their food sources, we're looking, as you say, we're looking at the deer that wander in but aren't really there anymore. The other one is the wild boar. So they went extinct in the country in the medieval times. They would have been a really important food source. One of the interesting things about boar, though, is that although they're not in Sherwood, they have returned to England. So they were kept in the 18th century, in the 80s for meat, 18th century, way too early, kept in the 80s for meat. A few of them managed to escape in the 90s, and they're now established in the southwest of the country. So although they're not at Sherwood, boar are back in the country, but they are still notably absent from our forest. So that's definitely one. It wouldn't have necessarily affected the outlaws, but if you go back far enough, there would have been bears. So we're looking at slightly over 1,000 years that they've been extinct in the country, probably a little bit too early for Robin Hood, but it certainly would have affected outlaws before that. We just don't tend to consider those the medieval times, periods a bit earlier than that. We've got things like one of the most notable absences is squirrels. So we've got huge numbers of grey squirrels, as you will have seen, but they've completely replaced the red squirrels. The red squirrels, well, the greys are bigger than them, they're stronger than them, they come around earlier in the spring, so they get first access to food. They also carry a disease that affects the reds, but doesn't affect them. And so red squirrels are extinct in that sort of area of England, unfortunately. Although I did have a conversation with Robin Hood recently, and he swears blind that he saw a red squirrel just over on the Thoresby estate. He's a clever man. And when he's telling me, I'm inclined to believe him. So they may slowly but surely be coming back into the country, but who actually knows? They haven't been recorded yet, unfortunately. So we've lost those. They're sort of the notable animals that have gone. The plant life is quite an interesting one in that it's not the diversity that's gone down. It's a notable absence of a certain kind of oak. And I know we were going to sort of talk about this a little bit later on as well, but we've got, as you'll have seen, we've got a lot of very young oaks, we've got a lot of very old oaks, but we haven't got anything in the middle. We haven't got those sort of oaks that are, I'd say, between about 300 and 700 years old. Those ones are the ones that are missing. So it's not that a certain species is gone, it's that a certain age range is gone in one of those major species.
That is a little bit odd, that idea that there would be an age range that's missing. That's not the sort of thing you think about. You think about a thing being either present in a continuous line or just being absent.
Yep.
So you mentioned that intermediate age of 300 to 700 years for the age of these oaks is missing. That sounds pretty old to me, 300 to 700 years. That far outstrips a human existence, of course. But that's, as you're saying, an intermediate age for an oak tree. So how old do the oak trees get? How old are the ancient ones that are there in Sherwood?
So the lifespan of an ancient oak, you're typically looking at about 1,000 years. So it's often said that it takes about 300 years to grow, about 300 years to mature, and then about 300 years to die. That dying phase, really important for a lot of wildlife. So we actually want it to happen. In fact, one of the things that gets done in the forest these days is that we artificially age some of the trees, mimicking lightning strikes with chainsaws, cutting out certain holes to make as woodpecker homes, because then that lets the rot set in quicker. There's a whole host of things we do to age them. And the reason we've got very young ones and we've got very old ones and not a lot in between is very simple. Oaks rot from the inside. They hollow out completely. So once they reach a certain age, they are useless for timber. So what's happened is that when people have come through the forest looking for trees to cut down for timber, well, they've left the old ones alone. So if it's already about 500 years old, about 500 years ago, that will be one of those trees that we still have that's about 1,000 years old, because by the time they even got to it, worthless for timber.
Interesting. One of the things that I noticed in Sherwood is that a lot of those ancient oak trees that were there were very, very charismatic, you might say, that they were very, very interesting looking, that they had all kinds of peculiar growth patterns. They had a lot of character. Character is really the word I think I want there. And so
Yes.
of why they develop that much character as they get older is because of that kind of just internal rotting and evidence of how a tree like that that's kind of got a lot of character and is very gnarled and has weird growth in places that wouldn't be good for lumber. So that's why those ancient ones were left alone.
Absolutely. Yep, it's a really simple reason that, as you say, the character that they have is just built in all the way through that wood. And once that rot sets in as well, that tree, there's very little wood actually there. It's just a shell. So cutting down something so enormous for such a small reward, complete waste of everyone's time.
So having those weird growths and lots of character probably saved those.
Quite possibly, yeah. Yeah, and as you know, they are such characters. I can't wait to get onto the bit where we talk about the individual oaks. I just love talking about them.
Well, why wait? Tell us about some of the individual oaks. They have so much character that you can look at these trees and you know them like as an individual entity. Tell us a little about the individual trees and your favorites.
Okay, so it wouldn't be right if I didn't at least mention the major oak. The major oak is the one that most people know. It's the one that's supposedly Robin Hood's tree. I could talk about the oak, that specific one, for days, but it's not my favorite tree in the forest, so I'm going to blow past the major.
Well, give us a quick encapsulation. Okay. What is the major oak for people who haven't been there?
Sure. So the major oak is the most famous tree in the forest, probably because it's the most unique. You'll have seen the shape of it is so unusual. We think it's actually three trees that have fused together and become one, and that's what's contributed to its massive size, but also its very unusual shape. So we think it's about 1,100 years old. Some estimates are younger, some estimates are older. That goes back to the rot. Because they don't have tree rings, we can't age them. We will never know. And the various stories of Robin Hood tells of, a tree that he would have lived in with his band of merry men. The major oak is the one that we think it might have been. So that's what it's become famous for, is Robin Hood's tree. But it's a fascinating feature just because it shouldn't be as healthy as it is for how old it is. It should be deep in its dying phase. For whatever reason, it's deep into its maturity phase still. So this tree could be alive for another 100, 200, maybe even 300 years. And then it's got to die off from there. This tree will be around for another half a millennium, which is one of the most incredible things to me.
Now, if somebody wanted to write a Robin Hood story, though, and have it set at the major oak, it would not be historically accurate for them to reference it as such. The name, the major oak, is more modern. That was what, in the 1770s that name came around. Is that right?
Yes, Captain Major Hayman Rook, I believe his name was. He travelled the length and breadth of Britain, wrote about his, various notable trees, and the major oak was his favourite, and that's why it became known as the Major's Oak, changed to Major Oak over the years. Yeah, it's had many, many names over the years. One of my favourites, for quite nefarious reasons, I suppose, is when it was known as the cockpen tree, because there was a time where it was used for storing cockerels for cockfighting. So a bit of a brutal existence at that point, as cockfighting is a fairly nasty sport that really shouldn't be a thing.
Right. Yeah, I can't say as that I'm sad at all that it is no longer a place for people engaging in that terrible sport. But
yeah,
what I think is worth noting and endearing that that's still evidence of how it was a meeting place. For hundreds and hundreds of years, this particular tree was still notable enough that people would meet there and gather there. And now it's there in Sherwood Forest as kind of a tourist attraction, but therefore still a meeting place, still a place that people are meeting.
Absolutely. When it came to the ancient oak forests, as you'll have seen, it's all relatively flat. It's all, there's huge amounts of undergrowth. It can be very difficult to find your way through the forest, and the oaks were actually used as waypoints and waymarkers, because you could describe what the oak was like, or you could say, go to the Stag's Head. You could say, go to Stumpy or go to Medusa. And they would be used as actual waypoints because they're all so unique that they can be used in that way.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. All right. So tell us some more about some of these other trees.
So I've just mentioned my absolute favorite tree in the forest. My favorite tree is called Stumpy. So Stumpy is not too far away from the visitor center. It's only about a 5-minute walk up the bridleway. And it is a tree that if you were to see it in the winter, you would assume it's been dead for centuries. It has completely fallen apart. It's only about 5 meters tall, which for an oak tree is nothing. It looks just ancient and rotted. But then the springtime comes and it is covered in leaves and it is still alive. And one of the most amazing things about Stumpy was that about 50 years ago, Stumpy died, but Stumpy came back to life about 5 years ago. Oaks are capable of just having these dormant periods where they appear dead and then resurrect and come back to life. And it's one of my favorite things is that these trees can come back to life. And at the moment, on one of Stumpy's sort of limbs is actually growing 2 silver birches. It is a tree that is growing its own trees. I'm not sure they're going to survive very long, but it's fascinating to see these tiny little silver birches coming out, leaves coming out of them as well. It's amazing.
Oh, that is really good. I love it. What are some other favorites?
So I know from Robin Hood, his personal favorite is the Stag's Head. So just a little bit down from the major oak, if you look over on the right, especially if you come just at sunrise, it looks like a stag that's throwing his head back with sort of full antlers. It's quite impressive. My wife's favorite is the bee tree. The bee tree is just a little bit further down that path. And every single year it has a beehive. Every single year there are honeybees in that tree. We don't know if it's the same hive that keeps returning year on year, or it's just, a brand new hive that finds this obviously amazing location and takes it over. We just don't know. But it's literally called the bee tree because it has a hive in it every single year. We've got Medusa, where she's got the snakes coming out the bottom, and I think she looks more like a witch's cauldron. That one is almost impossible to describe because Medusa is only about 1 meter off the floor. She's been cut down, but it's what's been left that's so fascinating. I think a witch's cauldron, and having met Robin's forest witch, yeah, I think she agrees with me.
I think I know which one you're talking about there. That would be Medusa. I remember seeing that and took a few photos with it. And it certainly, I couldn't see that and not think that it looked like some sort of site for druidic rituals or something.
It really does, doesn't it? I know that it's going to potentially feature, during Halloween events, if we can send people up there, brewing their potions in that one. But yeah, it's an absolutely fabulous tree. But then, as you know, the character that you have in these trees, the fact that you can name them, and some of them just have the most amazing stories, like Rotten Roger. Rotten Roger is called that because supposedly a man named Roger was sealed inside that tree and left to die. And that is why it became known as Rotten Roger, because Roger was sealed up inside it.
Oh, rotting or Roger.
Absolutely.
Well, so you mentioned Halloween, you mentioned the trees getting dormant, you mentioned the squirrels coming back in the springtime. What sort of is the weather and climate like there? How temperate is it? How harsh are the winters? How comfortable is it to be around in the various seasons? If somebody wanted to visit Sherwood in different seasons, kind of how would you recommend that they dress? What sort of weather would you recommend they prepare for?
As it's the UK, no matter what day you come in the year, take about 3 different changes of clothes, because you're likely to have sunshine in the morning, get hailed on in the afternoon, and then, maybe have a blizzard later on in the evening. We are a very temperate zone, but it's fairly obvious that we are experiencing climate change in the simple way that things are changing. It is very different. Our winters are a lot more inconsistent now. They feel a lot more like stormy autumns that just never seem to end. Doesn't really get that cold. We get some cold snaps, but it's not like you can count on the weather. I mean, you can't in the UK to begin with, but the winters, they're very inconsistent. And these days, surprisingly warm. Not what they would have experienced back in medieval times, although that does depend on which era you are looking at. So depending on weather, so Robin Hood's likely era, so we're looking at 950 to 1250, it was something called the medieval warm period. So it was actually similar to the mid-20th century. So if you imagine what the weather was like 50, 60, 70 years ago, that's a little bit more like what it was like for people like Robin Hood in the kind of 10th, 11th, 12th century kind of time.
So that would be generally cooler than it tends to be nowadays, but still warmer than it would have been for much of the medieval age.
Absolutely. And also back then, it would have been fairly consistent as well. So you knew when the winter was coming, you knew exactly what the weather was going to be like. You knew you were going to be getting the snows. It made it a lot easier to plan for the winter when you actually know what's coming up. For anyone familiar with the UK, you'll know the scramble that our councils go through to get the roads gritted in the winter because nobody seems to see it coming because it's so inconsistent. They would have had at least the consistency to be able to plan properly. So that was sort of the early medieval ages. A little bit later on, we actually have the Little Ice Age. So it's been argued that it goes back to the 14th century, but you're more likely to be looking at the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th kind of century. Temperature was a lot cooler than it is now. So it's why we call it the Little Ice Age. So at that point, the winters would have been really, really harsh. By then, Sherwood is starting to dwindle, so it would not have been the haven for outlaws that it would have been in, say, the 11th or the 12th century, but the winters then would have been so unbelievably harsh. Not many of the outlaws would have actually survived that winter. It would have been very difficult.
So real rough time trying to survive in the winter in the forest in that later period. That is actually an interesting thing, and one of the questions that I had was like, how easy would it be for people to try to live off the land there? And it sounds like, at least if we're talking in the late Middle Ages, very difficult in the wintertime.
Absolutely. It would have been very difficult regardless of the era that you were actually in. One of the sort of things that people said to me was like, how did they manage to live out there for so long? And the answer is usually they didn't. They usually died fairly quickly. Nature is brutal. And when we managed to separate ourselves from, that Darwinian survival of the fittest, and that's all we've managed to separate ourselves from when it comes to nature, the outlaws were then thrust right back into what is Darwinian nature, survival of the fittest. And we generally don't have the tools to be able to survive it on our own. So they struggled. And whether it's, even looking through the spring, the summer, when food is supposed to be bountiful, it was such a harsh environment to survive in, because you're not just battling the elements either. You are battling human beings. As an outlaw, you were actively hunted. So everything would have been against you, which is all well and good when we've got the modern conveniences that we do to be able to survive. They wouldn't have had any of those, no safety nets, terrible equipment. Yeah, it wouldn't have been fun being an outlaw.
All right. So that's a pretty bleak picture that you just painted.
Oh, yes.
There had to have been at least some things that could have worked in their outlaws' benefit. In the Middle Ages, that you mentioned, 100,000 acres of land. Sherwood Forest was home to royal deer parks. It was, of course, very illegal to be poaching those deer, but that's one of the things Robin Hood is famous for, is having those herds of deer that he would freely shoot and feast people on. The merry men would feast on. A lot of the stories really make things sound pretty good, at least from the perspective of there being already access to venison at that time. What else would they have had to draw from in terms of potential forageable food sources, medicinal herbs, wood suitable for making weapons? What did they have going for them?
The honest answer is not a lot. So they would have just tried to find absolutely anything that they could have found in the forest. So in terms of food sources, we're looking at things like nuts. So hazelnuts would have been a great source. They're a native tree, and they would have been scattered through Sherwood. We don't really have many these days, but it's a lot smaller than it was. Sweet chestnuts would have been another option. So they were brought over by the Romans. So not technically a native species, but they've been here for a long, long time. So the most of the nuts that they would have had, they could have gone for berries. So things like blackberries, raspberries, bilberries, very seasonal though. So there's only so long you can sustain yourself off of those. So when it comes to the food, unless they were hunting, there's not a huge amount of foraging that you can do besides nuts, berries, and fungi. Oh, sorry, forgot to mention fungi, in that we've got rather wonderfully named things like the beefsteak fungus or the chicken of the woods. Chicken of the wood supposedly tastes like chicken. I've never tried it myself, but I'm assured it's quite delicious. So they would have been able to have access to those, but very, very seasonal. In terms of their food, they would mostly have been looking at game or the humans around them. They would have struck up deals with local farmers. They would have potentially stolen from local farms. There is sort of evidence of extortion and bribery, trying to rule over certain people nearby through fear, but that never lasted long. It doesn't take long for someone to be, under the boot before they betray you to the local lords and, try and get that reward money for you. So when it came to scavenging in the forest, there isn't a huge amount of food that could sustain a large amount of them. You could probably sustain a small group, so maybe 2, maybe 6 people. Any more than that, and you are going to really, really struggle to find enough food without pillaging the local area, which attracts a lot of attention. It is not something you want to be doing if you can avoid it.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Really hurt some of those romantic notions of outlaws. But,
sorry.
That's
it's worse when I do this to children and go, just let me tell you how bad it was for the outlaw. Yeah, there's a chance that they could have lived, in those romanticized ways, but unfortunately, the world around them was just too harsh for that.
Yeah. There's a few of the early ballads, and I know Howard Pyle also picked up on this, that have these ridiculous numbers of men. Robin Hood will blow his bugle and scores of men will come pouring out of the woods. And there's this idea that there's like 120 men that he has living there, and the idea of actually trying to feed and clothe, this small army, always struck me as a little bit incredulous. Glad to hear that I was not wrong for thinking that.
No, you would most likely be right. I think where that actually comes from is a bit of a distortion of it, in that there were some outlaws who were known as gentlemen outlaws. They might have had land, they might have had people working for them. They're the people that can support a band, and maybe that's what's twisted into it. But when it comes to a band living inside the forest, when you've got everything against you, very, very difficult to live that way.
Now, one of the things that I think we should mention is that in some of the early ballads, including the very earliest ones, some of the medieval ones, Sherwood isn't mentioned, but Barnsdale is. Have you been to Barnsdale and spent much time there?
I have not. So it's one of those places that I really should go and visit. Although when it comes to Barnsdale, that's often the link of why people say that Robin Hood was actually from Yorkshire, and he wasn't from Nottingham at all. However, I can prove that he was not a Yorkshireman. I actually have the proof of that.
Yes, and what is your proof for that?
Well, my proof comes from my granddad. So my granddad was a proud Yorkshireman himself. And he told me when I was young that you'll always know a Yorkshireman because within the first 20 seconds of meeting him, he'll tell you he's from Yorkshire. That never comes up in the Robin Hood stories. Therefore, that is proof that he is not from Yorkshire. The thing I love most about that story is it's genuinely true. My granddad was from Yorkshire and he did tell me that. And it's been proved right on every occasion since he told me.
But we're going to get so many Yorkshiremen complaining about this, which will, of course...
Yeah, but they'll declare they're from Yorkshire and prove me right. You can't win on this one.
No. So, as I mentioned earlier, Howard Pyle is one of our most influential writers of Robin Hood. I think 1883 is when his Merry Adventures of Robin Hood came out. And he paints a very, very pastoral, beautiful, joyful picture of life in Sherwood Forest. And if you flip through his works, in almost any chapter, you'll come across some florid description of how idyllic that life sounds. So something I thought would be fun is to just grab a passage, something from early in the book, from the prologue, read it to you, and get your reaction in terms of how accurate you feel it is to being in the actual Sherwood Forest. Now, also granted, almost all of his descriptions seem to take place in the late springtime. So there's, zero idea of a harsh winter that even exists in the world of his Robin Hood. It was at the dawn of day in the merry May time, when hedgerows are green and flowers bedeck the meadows, daisies pied and yellow cuckoo buds and fair primroses all along the briery hedges. When apple buds blossom and sweet birds sing, the lark at dawn of day, the throstle cock and cuckoo, when lads and lasses look upon each other with sweet thoughts, when busy housewives spread their linen to bleach upon the bright green grass. Sweet was the greenwood as he walked along its paths, bright the green and rustling leaves, amid which the little birds sang with might and main.
My reaction is that it captures the majesty of the forest quite well. Although it would have been difficult for the outlaws, as you've seen, it is a stunningly beautiful place. And it does feel incredibly peaceful. And although I imagine the outlaws didn't feel peace for much of the time, there might have been those fleeting moments, where you come across an open glade just to find a beautiful scene in front of you. You wake in the morning and those first few sort of chirrups of the morning chorus. I would imagine there would have been those moments that they would have found that beauty and that peace in amongst a hail of arrows coming right at them. But yeah, the reason I love those kind of passages is that it might not capture what life was like for an outlaw, but it captures the beauty of the nature of the place. And it is marvelous. To me, there is nowhere in Britain as beautiful as Sherwood Forest. Ancient oak woodland, it is spectacular. And that passage there encapsulates it perfectly, just how beautiful it is.
And because this is one of Howard Pyle's favorite phrases, do you often find that the little birds sing with might and main?
Oh, absolutely. There is never a point in the forest where the bird song isn't just ringing out clear. Times where it's a little bit less, but otherwise it's always present, and it just adds to that inner peace. It's beautiful.
Any favorite bird songs?
Any favorites? I've never been asked that one before of which one's my actual favorite. I would probably say I would have to go for a wren. So a wren has got quite an unusual call. It's a beautiful song. There's a little bit of mechanical whirring at the end. And it's a joke I often like to tell and she loves it. My wife, she's a wren because she's really small, but really loud. How can that much volume come out of something so small? So yeah, I would say the wren is my favorite. Sweet and simple.
You can just tell her that she's singing out with her might and main.
Oh, absolutely.
So I actually have sitting right here by my computer this decorative ornament I picked up at Sherwood Forest of a robin wearing a Robin Hood hat, a bycocket.
The funny thing there, Thaddeus, is I could run upstairs and grab my one that's currently on the spare bedroom door. I've got that exact same ornament upstairs.
Not surprised at all. But that begs the question, are there robins?
Lots of them, lots and lots of robins. They are one of the species in the UK that is doing really, really well at the moment. There's a huge number of wildlife species in decline at the moment. The robin is not one of them. You cannot walk very far in the forest without seeing lots of them. And just like a lot of the robins in the UK, they are pretty tame. They've gotten so used to humans over the years. We don't really attack them. So they've gotten fairly comfortable around us, and they will come right up to you. In fact, I was sat in the staff car park having some lunch before I went on my paternity leave, and one of the hatchlings from this year landed on my shoulder briefly and then flew off when I sort of looked at it as if to say, what are you doing on there? It was a beautiful moment, but they are really tame and they're such wonderful little creatures. They are Britain's most popular bird for a reason. They're just packed with charisma, and they are so beautiful.
Now, for our American listeners, we have robins here in the States as well, but those are totally different birds, much larger, more aggressive also. And they just were called robins because they also have an orangish red color on their front.
They're much darker on the back, aren't they, American robins?
Yeah. So what we might think of as a robin here in the US is a different bird than the robin there in the UK.
Yes, comes up surprisingly often with things like the daddy longlegs. You call them crane flies. We call them daddy longlegs. You have a spider called the daddy longlegs. Causes a lot of confusion in this country as to how venomous they actually are because they get it mixed up between the two species. But yes, our robins, much, much smaller, but they are just as feisty. It's estimated about 1 in 10 robin deaths is due to them fighting because they are highly territorial. The thing about places like Sherwood is that they're actually quite a lot less aggressive towards each other. We think it's probably just because it's such an abundant food source, being an ancient oak forest, that they don't feel the need to be as aggressive each other. They're still getting as much food as they need regardless of whether they fight each other off. So they tend to be pretty tolerant of each other.
And what sort of food would that be?
Yeah, you're mostly looking at insects. They are mostly insectivores. So they will go for the odd bit of seed and things like that, but mostly they're looking at bugs. And yeah, there are a lot of bugs in a forest like ours.
So, that might have been, the key for the robin's namesake. Were there any actual outlaws trying to make their living there? Try to dig in on insects, embrace that sort of diet.
Yeah, this is the funny thing about hunger, is that you will abandon all of your ideals when it comes to food. So if the outlaws would have had to eat insects like the robins did, they absolutely would have done. Earthworms, supposedly nutritious. Wouldn't know myself, but yeah, earthworms, if you can get a hold of them, you may as well eat them if you can't get hold of anything else.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? A lot less legally dangerous, a lot less legally precarious than poaching the king's deer. Eating some deer.
Absolutely. Yeah. Poaching a deer is hard. One of the interesting things was we got some proof of whether or not outlaws were actually using the ancient oaks for their ill-gotten gain with the deer. So a tree fell over, I think it was in the 1980s, called the butcher's oak, and they actually found medieval hooks embedded onto the inside of the tree. So that was the proof that outlaws would have been using the oaks as little stash points for the deer. Trying to transport a deer through the forest when you don't have things like carts, you've got to take it all out on the back of your shoulders. It's heavy, it's hard work. You might need to stop and hide it from a forester. Stash it in one of the ancient oaks is what they're great for.
That brings up a good question also. Foresters, in the Middle Ages, there were people whose job it was to kind of serve as rangers of a sort. Do you know anything about what the career of a medieval forester would have been like, and how it's different from your own?
I must admit, I don't know too much about the foresters, other than they were essentially the police of the forest. So what we do today is we manage the land and we look after it. The foresters of the day, they weren't interested in looking after it. They were interested in stopping anyone who wasn't the king from actually accessing them and doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. Because that is one of the sort of differences between a forest and a woodland. Forest is a designation that's royal. It means that only the king can use that. Woodland is for the common man. Anybody can use it for any particular reason. And so the foresters, they were basically just police.
Were there any woodland areas in the kind of larger sphere of Sherwood?
There certainly would have been. Where they'd have been, I couldn't tell you, but it was one of those things that the woodlands dwindled over the years for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons would be just simply cutting it back, so that we've scaled back more and more to get more farmland in. But one of the other reasons was that at some point the nobles started realizing that this was land that nobody was making money off of, and so they started buying up lots and lots of woodlands so that they could charge people for using them or change the purpose of them. It very much got taken away from the common man over the years through greed.
So yeah, it's age-old story, the exact same sort of story that leads to tales of Robin Hood.
Absolutely.
Speaking of Robin Hood, you've alluded a few times to meeting Robin Hood, meeting the witch. And so I know that in addition to your work there with conservation and education in Sherwood, you also do a little bit more direct engagement with Robin Hood stories. Would you like to take a moment to talk about what you do there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I myself play Friar Tuck. I don't get to do it as often as I'd like, because I usually get reminded by my boss that I have a job to do that's not involving just getting dressed up. But yeah, as Friar, I get to tell the stories, I get to run activities, you get to do all sorts of different things. And it really is one of my favorite things in the world. If you would have told me sort of 3 years ago that getting dressed up in a costume was as fun as it is, I'd have maybe sort of turned my nose up a little bit at it. First time I got in costume, yeah, it's a lot of fun, because you can just have such a good laugh with people. You really can sort of open up and have some fantastic banter with the crowds. So yeah, we try and bring the stories of Robin Hood to life. It is far more entertaining meeting a costume character, especially when those young kids actually believe that this might be Robin Hood, or it might be Little John, might be Will Scarlet, or Maid Marian. That kind of magic is what Sherwood's all about. So that is certainly what we're trying to do, is just to bring more of that human element into the forest. It just adds so much to that experience of meeting the characters rather than just learning about them.
Yeah, I think that's great. How long have you been doing that now?
So it's a bit of an awkward one with COVID sort of getting in the way of a lot of it, but I've been at Sherwood now for 2 years, although I haven't actually been there for 2 years because of COVID and furlough. So I've been Friar Tuck for about 1.5 years, sort of on and off over the last, over the COVID period. So I've not been doing it very long at all, but I can see me doing it for a long, long time into the future.
Were there any sources that you found especially useful to pull from for informing how you were going to present the character of Friar Tuck, especially in an educational capacity?
Yes. Unfortunately, there were no sources, really. I made the decision after sort of playing it was a different character that I was playing. It was Brother Hugo, who's supposedly his nemesis. Then I was approached and said, do you want to be Friar Tuck? And I just thought, yep, and I'm going to play in my own way. I'm going to play him how I think the character is portrayed, because I've often been told that I play a very good Friar Tuck, but I'm not playing a character. I'm just being myself, just slightly exaggerated. And it seems to work so perfectly with the character, being this jolly monk that loves telling jokes, likes to drink a little bit too much. I thought, you know what? We've been writing these characters in different ways for 800 years. It's only fair I get to write them in my own way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. When you're being Friar Tuck and kind of embodying that role, do you find that's a little bit easier to engage with audiences as opposed to not being in that persona, just kind of being an interpreter for Sherwood Forest and the RSPB?
It does depend on the audience, because there are certain audiences that respond better to the uniform and want to know more about the nature, the wildlife. They're not really there for the legend. When you're in the costume, it is much easier to engage with people overall, though, because as being the drunken, lecherous monk that Friar Tuck was in some of the stories, I can be as forceful as I want in trying to engage with people. If they don't want to engage with me, we just let them go. But otherwise, it's kind of hard not to stop and talk to Friar Tuck when he's drunk and, calling you over. It's great fun doing that.
Forms a hook to draw people in, but that's also a good point. You seem less authoritative when it comes to actually discussing information about nature and the plants and wildlife there.
Absolutely. I have done both before. I've taken costume tours where I've done a few of the tales and then talked a bit about the wildlife. The group that I was with, though, much older, so they responded really well to that informational side. They just wanted to have it done as Friar Tuck because they all said it'd be far more entertaining than just a guy in just a normal uniform. Yeah, it was a great day, that was.
Yeah, interpretive work and how to bring people in, and the usefulness of legendary figures and characters like that is something I have a lot of personal interest in, a little bit of personal history and experience with, but a topic that I really enjoy exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the great things about all those characters that you talk about there is that we actually have characters in the forest now that nobody's ever heard of. So if we talk about Ivar, who is the man who taught Robin Hood how to shoot a bow, or Morda, Robin Hood's forest witch, these are characters that we've created, because if we've been writing Robin Hood stories for 800 years, why stop now? Let's introduce more characters and bring more life to the story, even if they're modern. There's no problem with that, because most of the stories are fictitious retellings. They're not based on fact. They're based on this legend that has come out. So let's keep writing them.
Yeah, I don't know that I've read or watched a single adaptation of Robin Hood that didn't include the inclusion of some characters that were brand new out of the creation, out of the imagination of the author. And even a lot of the character names that we're familiar with will change dramatically from one interpretation to another. So yeah, there seems absolutely nothing wrong with continuing to invent new characters, continuing to add to the legend, and just kind of letting it be your own.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you've said there about characters coming in later on. If we look at Prince John as a character, which a lot of the stories these days is based around Prince John and King Richard on the Crusades, he didn't appear until the late 19th century in any of the stories. Prince John is a really late addition, but now he's almost become synonymous thanks to partly the Disney film. Prince John in that was such a larger than life character, really brought it to the forefront of people's knowledge. And it's almost like people think, second nature now. Prince John, he's part of the Robin Hood stories. He's a really late addition.
Yeah, Hollywood did a lot to really cement the idea of Robin Hood taking place during the reign of Richard I, with Prince John as an antagonist. It's there in the Douglas Fairbanks movie and the Errol Flynn movie. And it was around beforehand. Richard I is a major character in Ivanhoe, which also features Robin Hood, which was wildly popular. But you're right, in the earlier tales, in the ones that gave birth to those later adaptations, it was not Prince John serving as any sort of antagonist. The Sheriff of Nottingham was around, though. He's been around for a long time. Him and Guy of Gisborne. Those are
he has, and it always makes me laugh a bit. As Friar Tuck, I'm considered one of the big five. You've got Robin, the Sheriff, Little John, Maid Marian, and Friar Tuck as the characters that virtually everybody knows. However, Friar Tuck and Maid Marian are fairly late additions into the stories as well. They came across with the May Games from France. So even those characters that you cannot part these days, Robin Hood and Maid Marian, they are absolutely, tethered together, but yet they're not in the original stories like that. Nope. Maid Marian is a later addition.
Yeah, I had one of our earlier episodes was devoted all to Maid Marian and where she choose to tell stories with her. And I've got a episode or an interview next week with Mike Nichols, who wrote a play called The Gospel of Friar Tuck. And so we're going to have a lot of similar discussion about Friar Tuck.
I will be listening intently to that one. Yep, I'm looking forward to that.
So just a couple more questions for you. A sort of serious one. Since you work for the RSPB and Sherwood, and conservation is part of your mission, what can listeners do to help with current conservation efforts?
So my advice about this one does depend a little bit on which side of the pond that you're on, because I know that you've got listeners and viewers on both sides. And it is a little bit different for people in the UK compared to the US, just because your conservation is not as desperate as ours is. When you think about one of the greatest things America's ever done in the national park system, you've still got a lot of your nature left. So a lot of my advice is aimed more towards people in the UK. So the first thing that we can all do is talk with your wallets. So there are so many organizations out there on both sides that need as much support as possible. And for me, working for the RSPB, I never take shame in begging for money, because I know people in the UK, we often don't like to talk about money, but why should we as an organization feel shame in asking when all of that money goes towards a good cause? We are incredibly proud of just how much money goes towards the cause. And it's not just us either. The Wildlife Trust, the Woodland Trust, you've got smaller charities like Bug Life and Plant Life, the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, the Canals Trust. There are so many charities out there that desperately need support. And that is the simplest and easiest way that you can help. Just, if you can, just give a small amount of money to these charities each month. That is the simplest and easiest way. You don't even have to do anything. Just write down your bank details one time, and then from there on in, £5 a month. job's a good one. So that's one of the things that people can do that's really easy. Another thing that is really important is that if you happen to have spare time, that is one of the most important resources that we can get hold of right now. Organizations like the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, the Woodland Trust, we rely on volunteers. Volunteers can do huge numbers of roles, whether it's admin roles, whether it's conservation roles. There's all sorts of things that people can do. And if you've got a spare, even if it's just 1 hour a month, there is something that you can do to make a difference. Even if you just go litter picking in your local area for an hour, that is something. So they're always appreciated. The other things that people can do, things like in your back garden, small conservation efforts. So you could make a bug house, you could make a hedgehog house, make a butterfly feeding station, a bird feeding station. There's all sorts of little improvements that people can make in their gardens that are going to make a massive difference. Once again, not as important for you in the States. You know, a lot of you, well, I say a lot of you, some of you have really big plots of land with big gardens, and it makes me super jealous. So it is more focused on the people in the UK who have these smaller gardens. But if everyone did a small thing, then good things happen. We'll take the example of the hedgehog. We've lost about 97% of our hedgehogs. They are in real trouble. We've lost huge volumes. One of the biggest problems they're faced with, modern fencing. We've put modern fencing into our back gardens. It cuts hedgehogs off from feeding and breeding grounds. And just by cutting a small hole in a fence or raising up a concrete plinth on bricks so that there's a gap underneath, that alone, if everybody did that in the UK tomorrow, there is no way that something like the hedgehog would go extinct. But unfortunately, that's not the way our modern society was built. We've all got, you know, fencing in our back gardens that's really detrimental to our wildlife. So just doing those small things in the garden, that makes a big difference. So I would say those are the three things: your money, your time, and making small improvements in your garden. Those three things, not all that difficult to do either, depending on whether you have the time, you have the resources. You know, some people don't. That's absolutely fine. But if you can manage any of those three, you're making a big difference.
I think that's some excellent advice, excellent suggestions. And a lot of that can still apply to the US also.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I'm not as aware of your conservation efforts as I am sort of on the ones in the UK. And I know you have your problems as well. But those three things cover absolutely everyone. So yeah, good advice there.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, our final question I like to ask for guests. It's a little bit different for you since you do have your own presentations of Robin Hood you do. But aside from those, do you have a favorite interpretation of the character, a favorite take, a favorite adaptation, whether it's book, film, television? If you were somebody were to say, I want, you know, your suggestion for a Robin Hood story, what would you give them?
It depends how they wanted to go. If they wanted an absolute romp of an adventure, Prince of Thieves all the way. If you want something that's maybe a little bit more historically accurate in terms of the era, maybe not the story, we're looking at the Russell Crowe. But for me, it will always be Men in Tights. Just every single time I watch that film, I am in absolute stitches. And that is what I would recommend. But that's the great thing about the stories of Robin Hood, is that no matter what your kind of genre is, what your style is, and I've only talked through the movies, you know, if you are big into your reading your stories, there is a wealth of things out there. Not a big reader myself. I tend to just make up my own stories when it comes to being Friar Tuck. But that is one of the most endearing things about Robin Hood, is he can be who you want him to be.
Yeah. Now, that's one of the things I love as well. And one of the things that's been coming out more and more through doing this podcast.
Yeah.
Before I let you go, do you have any last words about Sherwood Forest, the impressions of being there, or anything else you would like to get across?
The only thing I would get across is that if you have the opportunity, whether you're in the UK, whether you're abroad in the States, if you can find yourself to Sherwood, do it. It is such a beautiful place, and there is something so peaceful about it. And so many people I talk to who say, oh, I'm only coming here for the first time, or I've lived in Nottingham for 20 years and never been. Find yourself a reason to go visit. There'll be lots of events and activities happening over the next year. So by all means, look on Sherwood's website and see what it is that you might want to do. It's a little bit sparse at the moment as I've been on paternity leave and it's mostly me in charge of that. But there'll be all sorts happening, and just find an excuse, whether it's for the legend, whether it's for the nature, whether it's just for that mindfulness, peacefulness of getting out and about. Find a reason to go. It is incredible, and you will fall in love with it if you go, just as everyone I know has. It only took me 2 visits and I was in love with the place.
And you can take a direct bus line from Nottingham to Sherwood Forest. It's
absolutely. There is I believe it's called the Sherwood Arrow. I think it runs on the hour. I think it's 1:15 the hour. I don't know the timetable, but yeah, the Sherwood Arrow runs directly from the city centre all the way out to Sherwood. It's not a particularly long drive, especially for you Americans. 45 minutes, that's nothing for you lot, but that's an epic journey for us. But it's really easy to reach. And yeah, it is one of those places that has almost disappeared. The UK has 1% left of its ancient oak woodland, and a lot of that is at Sherwood. It's not coming back for thousands of years, even if we replant it, because then it's not ancient. Make the most of seeing it while you can, because it might not be there forever.
Yeah. I think I can't end on a better line than that. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for taking some time out of the Greenwood to join us here in the Greenwood.
No, it's been my absolute pleasure. The fact that I've waffled on for so long, you can tell how much I love the place. And if anyone's watching this, then they must have that love too. So then, every one of your viewers, friends of mine, I think.
Right. Thank you again so much. And congratulations on your new addition to your family. I hope that's all going well.
Thank you very much. My daughter is going to be introduced to Sherwood the moment that she is allowed out the house. All righty. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, Thaddeus. It has been lovely chatting to you. Thank you. Cheers.
My thanks again to Andrew West for sharing his experience and expertise. If you'd like to hear more about what Sherwood Forest was like in the Middle Ages, including the origins of its name, you can also listen to the very first episode of the podcast and the interview with archaeologist James Wright. If you've ever been to Sherwood Forest and have a favorite tree of your own you'd like to share, or simply have a question or suggestion for a future episode, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. You can also email us directly via intogreenwood@gmail.com. Into the Greenwood is completely ad-free, and we're hoping to keep it that way. To do that, though, we do need your support. Contributions for as little as $1 per episode on patreon.com/intogreenwood go a long way towards keeping us on the air. And because we value both charity and conservation, 10% of all proceeds go to the selected top-rated foundation of Trees, Water, People. Non-monetary contributions, such as positive ratings and reviews that help us get noticed in the Podfinder algorithms, and good old-fashioned word of mouth, go a long way towards helping small, independent podcasts like this one. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. Earlier, you heard the recording of a wren song from Patrick Aberg of the RSPB, and to play us out, we'll listen to his recording of a robin, singing, as Howard Pyle would say, with all his might and main.